of the dispersion, partially because they're also, like all human beings, looking to make a livelihood. And so some of these Jewish settlements are not the product of opposition or persecution, they're the product of opportunity and desire. And that only expands when the Romans take over the area, because the Romans control all the way from the English Channel to the Mediterranean and North Africa, as well as the Middle East. And so they're in the time frame of the Roman Empire, even though the Jews in the Jewish homeland rebel and are squashed repeatedly to the point where the temple is torn apart and cast down the mountainside. Anybody been to Jerusalem other than Diana? You've been there, and you see at the bottom of Temple Mount, there are these huge stone blocks, okay? Guys in construction around here, you say, they build it with stone blocks, and they're thinking 6x8 cinder blocks. And it's like, no. This is like a 16x24 block of stone that was hauled to the top of this mountain to make the temple. And the Romans pushed them all down, tore it down. It's crazy. Yeah. They called some North Country guys with their tractors and sleds, and yeah. It is astounding the technology that ancient people had. Pulley, yes. The pulley system will literally take a several ton block, and if you have repetitive pulleys, every pulley cuts the weight in half. So you have a dozen pulleys, and the thing with energy feels like it only weighs a couple of pounds. So it's crazy. It's nuts. Yeah, so what? They might have been a kind of a snatch block. It might have been, yeah. But the biggest thing I've seen is that they would have like 4 pulleys on one side, all roped together with 4 pulleys on the other. And that combination of weight distribution just allowed them to do all kinds of nutty things. Build pyramids and build the temple on top of a mountain. So if you were in the homeland, you often were targeted. But if you were a Jew living in Spain under the Roman Empire, if you were a Jew living in Morocco under the Roman Empire, and you weren't causing trouble, they didn't necessarily come looking for you. And the Jews tended to clump in little communities, and if they had enough people, they would form a synagogue. And that's the movement of the gospel through the Roman Empire, was that Paul went synagogue to synagogue, and if he met opposition, then he left the synagogue and would preach the gospel to the general public, believing Jew or believing Gentile, didn't matter to him. And so in these Roman communities, you have the pagan Roman culture, you have the Jewish monotheistic subculture village group, and then you have the Christian faith starting to filter into this environment. And Dave Recklin asked me a question a little bit ago about what happened to the Jewish Christians in that transition time of the fall of the Roman Empire to the establishment of European cultures. And the short answer, my regular answer would be way longer, but I'm going to stick to a short version. The short version is these folks basically stopped identifying themselves as Jews. They were Christians. They were followers of Messiah. And in Greek, Messiah is Christ. So they're no longer Jewish Messiah believers. They're now just generic Christ believers. And so as the Roman Empire falls apart and these new kingdoms are formed and people came through and said, "What are you?" they would say, well, I'm a disciple of Jesus. I follow the Christian religion. And their Jewishness fell off, which is why in the middle 1900s, okay, in the middle 1900s, you have people starting to do genealogy research on their families, and there's a whole bunch of Europeans who are shocked to find out that their ancestors were Jews, because they didn't identify as Jews. They'd become Christians, as the terminology is. And so they identified that way in the new culture design. So that kind of brings us up to Jewish communities spread throughout the Roman Empire, and then the Roman Empire collapses, okay? So when Rome falls, there are Jewish communities all around the Mediterranean world. And some of them are very distinct and actually pretty influential. Some of them are just communities. They're just folks. And when the barbarians show up, they basically wipe out the Roman Empire, the political organization of the Roman Empire, and they substitute themselves in there. But the Jewish communities are still there. So there are now Jewish communities, in some cases holding on to ancient traditions that are just so incredibly out of step with what the Roman Empire at least had given people a sense of unity. You could have a Roman passport, so to speak. In fact, that's even in the New Testament. A couple of times Paul gets in trouble, and the Roman authorities come to keep the peace, and Paul says, "But I'm a Roman citizen," and it's almost like a get out of jail card in Monopoly, He just flashes this statement, and everybody stands back and goes, "Oh, yes, sir, it's okay, fine, go ahead." And by the way, that it is that dramatic in Roman law. The Roman citizen had astounding powers in the Roman government, under the Roman authority. But once that disappears, once Rome is gone, you have all kinds of different barbarian tribes settling different parts of Europe. Probably one of the few groups whose name still echoes their ancient heritage are the French, because it was the Franks who came into that part of Europe, a specific tribe called the Franks, and took it away from the Romans and resettled it and built their own cultural empire. But there are a dozen or more, all stuck around the place. So the barbarians create new homelands for themselves, and the Jewish communities are included in that. Sometimes the barbarians converted to Christianity. In the long run, all of them do. But it was kind of almost a case-by-case basis, depending on what part of what century we're talking. But I'm painting this with a broad brush, so I'm just going to kind of flow through with this middle ground here. When the barbarians realized that the prevailing glue in any given area of Europe was Christianity, in order to legitimize their new ownership of the ancient Roman Empire, they would call themselves Christians. So some of the barbarian tribes, some of the barbarian leaders creating new kingdoms became Christians out of a true conversion event. They really saw the value of this faith. They really saw the quality of life that came out of this faith and had some real personal experience. Such that if you read, if you really are having a hard time getting to sleep at night and you want to read old European history, it's a cure. Amazing stuff. So what you'll read is periodically there will be Louis the Pious, or Charles the Gentle, or Frederick the Magnanimous. And what they're trying to tell you is that these particular kings, rulers, had taken on some aspect of their faith that really marked their character. Others didn't always have those kinds of names. Some of them had some really nasty names. But there were some examples of true conversion. There were also lots of examples of conversions that were just simply, hey, we're the new boss in town and you want to get along with us, so we're going to kind of believe the way you believe and we'll play your game and then we'll all get along fine. So there were as many true conversions as there were convenient conversions, I guess I'd call them. Late ancient Christianity, medieval Christianity is a little weird. Because Christianity became the Roman religion, the official Roman religion, by edict, not by choice, it changed the way the gospel moved amongst people. And there were things brought into the faith that just have absolutely no biblical basis, but they're culturally Christian practices. We pray with our eyes closed and our head bowed, which is an ancient barbarian practice of submission to a higher authority. By the way, that's the way they addressed their mortal kings. Okay, when you came in front of the king, you closed your eyes and bowed your head because you really hoped he wasn't going to kill you, which was his right. He didn't have to let you live in his presence. Older churches from early Christianity, the stained glass images don't have anybody praying with their eyes closed or their heads bowed. They're all praying like this. Hands open, eyes open, looking up. Because they're based on the early Christian practice of what the angels said to disciples when they saw Jesus ascend. Right? If you read that end of Luke, beginning of Acts, they're all standing there looking up, and the angel said, the same way you see him leave, that's how he's going to come back. And the anticipation in the early Christian faith was, he's coming back. So that's how they prayed. And that's what the early stained glass shows you. It's not until later Middle Ages that they start to have a different image. So this official Christianity is a little different than conversion Christianity. And it just has some strange ideas in it, including the fact that very few people read the Bible. Literacy in the Roman Empire was actually pretty high. And with the coming of the barbarians, general literacy collapsed. And so people didn't read their Bibles, and they were just told what to believe, and they went along with that. And that's why there are so many instances leading up to the great Protestant Reformation in the 1500s of people reading their Bibles and suddenly going, wait a minute, why am I behaving like this? Okay, Martin Luther wasn't the first one. There were other reformers challenging the church, in some cases hundreds of years before Martin Luther got away with what he got away with. So Christianity itself is in flux, and it's not stabilized on a biblical foundation at this point. And part of the sad trend, and this is only one of the sad trends, is that there begins to be part of the teaching that the Jews were the killers of God. That's the whole reason Jesus was killed, because the Jews were going to kill God, and they were going to somehow reject whatever he represented. And it becomes the platform, really, for 1,000 years of persecution under any given European government. Because of the way Christianity was infused in the politics, you get government policies based on this erroneous thinking in the church, and you get behaviors that are just sanctioned. Now, they weren't always out to kill the Jews. The actual experience could be as mild as simply being ignored, and although that sounds mild, If you've ever been ignored, you know how suffocating that can be. So there were parts of the European barbarian kingdoms, the new kingdoms starting in Spain and Italy and France and Germany, North Africa, that just simply said, oh, they're in their little communities and they're not like us, they're not Christians, they rejected Jesus, and we're just going to ignore them. And so these communities become isolated. The other extreme is that they were randomly targeted with severe violence, including executions. So things like being forbidden citizenship meant that there were just certain things you couldn't do, or if something was done against you, there was nothing you could do about it. If you're not a citizen, you can't use the court system. So somebody comes and steals your horse, and you say, that guy stole my horse, and the judge says, who are you? I'm sorry, I don't recognize you as a person. You're not a citizen of our country. You live in an isolated village. You're an outcast. You probably didn't even have a horse to get stolen because you don't even exist under our laws. That can get a little strange. And there are some parts of Europe that practiced that right up through the 1900s. Okay, it's not like what stuff I'm talking about might have started a long time ago, but it is staggering how long it lasted in some parts of Europe and the Middle East. So they couldn't belong to, they didn't have citizenship, they couldn't belong to certain guilds and crafts, they were marginalized in legal behaviors and actions, they weren't included in the definitions of some of the laws. One of the bizarre things that happened is that they were frequently targeted as the cause for troubles. When the bubonic plague swept Europe, the Jews must have carried it. This is so pronounced an attitude that it actually made it into some books of the time. So you read some fiction about heroes, and there'll be this offhanded comment about, yeah, so then they treated me like one of the Jews carrying the plague. And it's like, what? What are you talking about? Nobody talks like that now, and so we don't get it. But they literally blamed traveling Jewish merchants for carrying the plague around with them. Just strange things. Because the Jews themselves had wanted their communities to be tight-knit, the new European governments went right along with it and said, fine, go ahead and we'll segregate you out there. So they lived in urban ghettos and villages that were isolated, intentionally isolated and ignored by the governments. Like I said, blamed for all kinds of disasters and whatnot. And sometimes, and this was most particular in Central and Eastern Europe, there were things called pogroms which targeted the Jews. And again, it wasn't just one answer fits all. It included things like a government official simply showing up one day and saying, this land is no longer yours and everybody has to be gone in 30 days. The soldiers are going to come through and burn your village. And so they were suddenly made into refugees inside their own country. The Fiddler on the Roof story ends that way, that after having been a Jewish segregated village and targeted for attacks, suddenly one of the Russian officers shows up and says, you've all got to move, and you've got 30 days to do it, because this isn't yours anymore. And that's how the movie ends, is with the families all moving off to other villages. So Central and Eastern Europe tended to practice that kind of stuff a lot more. And sometimes, like I said, they were refugees in their own country, and sometimes they were expelled from the country. Spain expelled all the Jews. They could either convert or leave after Ferdinand and Isabella took control. So just before Columbus is given his 3 ships to go find America, they had issued an order that all the Jews needed to leave the country. And then probably 200 to 300 years later, the French king did the same thing. This is a Catholic country. I don't want anybody in here who's not Catholic. The Protestants and the Jews, and he targeted 2 groups. The Protestants and the Jews have an opportunity to convert to Catholicism or get out of the country. So internal immigration was an issue, but external expulsion was just as often practiced. And then, like I said, bottom line is they oftentimes were just targeted for an attack, targeted by the government. And so the European Jewish communities, sometimes for generations, would be left alone, would almost be accepted as the odd guys out, but part of our community, and then other times just abused horribly by what was going on. Now, remember, back in the Middle East, there are still Jews. They didn't all leave. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and tore down the temple, there were Jews still left in that area, just simply because they didn't have the money to get out, or they had something that they felt held them there more than the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. The other thing that's happening in the Middle East is that even though Rome has collapsed in the West, there's this little pocket of Roman authority left in a place called Byzantium. And the Byzantine kings rule the Middle East probably for another 800 years, but on a constantly shrinking basis. One of the biggest things that happens is that in the 600s, a new religion appears. This is when Islam shows up in the Middle East. And Islam begins a long process of expansion by conquest. And they move across North Africa, and they actually jump from North Africa across the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain. And in the 600s and 700s, they actually conquer Spain. And they're there until Ferdinand and Isabella conquer the country and kick them out. So they're there from the 700s through the 1400s. So they're there about 700 years. They also move all the way into India, okay? So if I had a big enough map here from the Atlantic Ocean of Spain and North Africa to India, the new Muslim religion influences this area, typically by conquest. Well, what happens is, as the Islamic kingdoms expand, the Byzantine Empire is fighting them and is slowly being collapsed. Again, snapshot kind of history. Depending on what snapshot we're talking about in this period, sometimes this is a unified Islamic dynasty that reaches from the Atlantic to India. Sometimes it fractures into little kingdoms and subsections. And much like the history of Europe, the history of the Islamic people is, who's the most powerful ruler? Does he make a big empire, or is he satisfied with just keeping his own little backyard clean, so to speak? So in the 800s, the empire stretched for thousands of miles. 150 years later, there's 15 different little Islamic kingdoms. 70 years later, there's another big Islamic dynasty that conquers the whole area. So again, it depends on what snapshot of time you're looking at, that there are either multiple Islamic kingdoms or one big dynasty. What's interesting here, though, in this whole story is because the Muslims are newcomers, when they show up in the Middle East and they're asking about what's the land I just conquered, remember it was the Romans who changed the name of this region from Judah to Palestine because they were snubbing the Jews who were giving them so much trouble. And the survivors that are left don't call it Judah. This is now hundreds of years later, and a reference to a place has now become the norm. So the term Palestine sticks to this ancient Jewish homeland under the rule of the Muslims, and pretty much from the early Middle Ages until the United Nations edict in 1949 divides Palestine. That's how it's phrased. They're going to take the land of Palestine and divide it into a Jewish homeland and a Palestinian homeland. So from whenever the Romans named it in the 3rd century to 1949, the title Palestine clings to that. Kind of the way that the word Kleenex clings to facial tissues. It's a brand name, but it's not really the name of the thing. And so the brand name of Palestine is used by the Arabs to describe this land, and it just sticks. And regardless of your background, you're Jewish, you're a Palestinian. You're an Arab, you're a Palestinian. You're a Muslim, you're a Palestinian if you live in that area. So this becomes a piece of nomenclature, naming something that just sticks. And like I said, history teacher that I am, I've got way too many maps. And it's just an interesting little piece that from the Middle Ages up through 1949, maps that have to do with the Middle East or the Mediterranean world, Palestine sticks there because that's the name that they left. So just a real quick look here. So we've got various barbarian tribes up in Europe that are settling down to become countries. You've got the Byzantine Empire, which is this leftover thing from the Romans. And then you have Islam starting in the Arabian Peninsula, and it expands radically out of its hearth area, they call it. And over time, it sweeps all the way across North Africa and ends up in Spain, and you'll notice that the Byzantine Empire disappears. What's crazy is, this isn't like a chess game and it doesn't happen very quickly. Islam shows up in the 600s. The last Byzantine capital falls to an Islamic army in 1550, okay? So it's like 900 years of warfare. We get bored if something lasts more than 37 minutes. The attention based on the news cycle is from noon to 6 o'clock. And these guys resisted for 900 years. It is crazy sometimes to read ancient history and hear that a family fought for whatever from great-grandfather to grandfather to father to son to grandson to great-grandson, generation after generation. The Byzantines resisted right literally to the fact that the walls of their last city had to be breached, and the siege took the city. So it's kind of that whole thing happening out there is just a unique thing unto itself too. And again, the Jewish communities are sprinkled all through this stuff. There were Jewish merchants in Byzantium when the Muslims came over the walls and destroyed the city. But there were Jews living in Palestine peacefully under Islamic rule. They had to pay a head tax to maintain their independence, but it depended on where you were. If you were in the middle of the gunfight, you might get hit. If you were in some place that nobody was paying any attention, things went on as normal. So, besides some of the negative things that were happening to the Europeans, happening to the Jews in Europe, Europe was changing, particularly economically. There's this period we call the Renaissance, where trade was revived, and even though the Muslim kingdoms had fought with the European Christian kingdoms, that fighting had also created some trade and some international connections, and Europe was changing radically. And the Jewish communities, most of them, had an opportunity to change with these changes. For example, in the Old Testament, it says that Jews can't lend money to Jews with interest. What's most of Europe? Oh, Christians. Guess what I can do to you? You need $100? 10% interest monthly. How's that sound, Bob? Yeah, a lot of the Jews controlled the finances through their very careful lifestyles. The disciplines of the Jewish religion gave them a lifestyle that was not extravagant or bold and careless. And so they had money. They could lend it to the Christians at interest and make more money. Ever hear of the House of Rothschild and its banking holdings in Europe? Oh, Rothschild, it's a Jewish name. Yeah, they held the wealth of dozens of Europeans, of Europe's most wealthy families, because they were trustworthy, because they had integrity, and they were Jewish. And so, oddly, Christians couldn't lend Christians money at interest, because they took that Old Testament guideline for the Jews and applied it to themselves. But the Jews could lend money at interest. So there's this really odd economic shift that occurs. The Renaissance opens up a whole new world of economic trade, and the Jews get to benefit from that. In other professional skills, even though they were not allowed to join the Gentile guilds, the crafts groups, there were Jewish craftsmen, again, because of the kind of discipline innate in the Jewish lifestyle, Jewish craftsmen were highly regarded even though they weren't part of the guilds. The guilds were a form of union protection back in the old days. And but the Jews had such a good reputation based on the quality of their work that their professional skills in medicine and metal crafts, particularly gold, silver, and precious gemstone work, was highly respected. And okay, you don't belong to a guild, so I don't get the certification of safety that you're a guild member, but you know what? You're Jewish, and I can trust the fact that your work is done so well. Oddly, the Jews who were in the parts of the world held by the Muslims suffered less than those who were in European-controlled areas. And part of that was just the way that Islam looked at its own history. Islam looked at the fact that they came from Ishmael's family, and that the Jews came from their cousin. And so even within early Islam, there was a more respectful, courteous treatment of the Jews. The current anti-Jewish movement is really a byproduct of the Jewish homeland movement from the 18 and 1900s, okay? If you went back 150 years, you wouldn't necessarily find the animosity between Jewish and Muslim groups in the Middle East or North Africa. They didn't hold each other in that kind of antagonism. The conflict is actually much more recent. They did have to pay what was called a head tax in order to practice some of their own religious behaviors. And something that developed, and I couldn't quite exactly find out when, but part of this thing called the Seder, I think I pronounced that right, which is the end of the Passover ceremony. It's the one that we turned into communion. It's the part of the Jewish ceremony of Passover that we turned into communion. They began to end the Seder with this phrase, next year in Jerusalem. They didn't say that. It's not in the Bible. There's nothing in the Bible that has a final conclusion statement for the Passover feast. And obviously you wouldn't say that if you were already there. So David and Solomon and the kings of Israel, they were in Jerusalem. So why would they say next year in Jerusalem? So somewhere in late antiquity, early Middle Ages, the dispersed Jews began to add this little ending, and it becomes a thread of hope that someday their homeland would be restored to them. Some of it is tied to the fact that even in this dispersion in the Middle Ages and up through the 15 and 1600s, Jewish scholars are maintaining the scriptures, the Jewish Old Testament. And they're teaching in their local synagogues that God will call the people home. And so between the ending of the Seder being added and this teaching that there is a homeland for the Jews, that God said he will bring his people home. And lots of people said, yeah, it happened historically already. But the scholars, the Jewish scholars would say, yes, it's happened already historically, but that doesn't mean it won't happen again. And so there begins this background idea that God would allow the Jews to come home again and reestablish a homeland. Now, it starts to become very strong because it dovetails with something that happens in European history as well. Though the Europeans look at it one way, the Jews take this idea as part of their own. The 1700s in European history is full of thinkers asking questions about why is European culture the way it is. Some of the thinkers are driven by biblical Christian thinking. Some of the thinkers are driven by purely non-biblical thinking. And the ones who really think well of themselves and the ones who think that they're really coming up with brilliant new ideas, there are two times in world history where events get their name when the event is occurring. The Renaissance wasn't called the Renaissance for hundreds of years, okay? The Middle Ages, they didn't wake up like in 999 and say, oh, it's the Middle Ages. Okay, stuff like that didn't happen. It's kind of fun to tease about it, but it didn't happen that way. It was called the Middle Ages like hundreds of years later. Historians looked back and said, oh, that's kind of like the middle of these ages. Okay, it's more like that. Two exceptions. One, the Enlightenment. When the Enlightenment occurred as a movement, the secular thinkers were so impressed with themselves, and I'm telling you the God's honest truth, they thought they were little geniuses, okay? The arrogance of Rousseau and Locke and some of these guys is just, it almost makes me cringe reading them talk about themselves. Well, I just came up with this brilliant idea about how society should change. You know, it's like, oh my gosh. Yes, right. Yes, their grandchildren are in charge now. Yeah, it really does. It's kind of nauseating. I'm surprised they didn't all have like broken arms from patting themselves on the back. But a lot of the secular ones were just so impressed with their new thinking, you know. The king shouldn't rule. It should be the voice of the people. The representatives of the people should control the government. Lots of the stuff that our country is run on came out of the Enlightenment. Could be a connection there. One of the ideas was that people groups who share a culture and a history should have their own government and country. Ergo, 1774, a bunch of farmers on Lexington Green have a fight with the British. 8 years later, a new country is born. Okay? So the United States of America is a product of this. A people group who share a language and a culture should have a government in the land where they live. Oh, good idea. So things like the American Revolution. We don't talk about this a lot in American history, but about 50 years after our revolution, the entirety of Latin and South America rebelled against their European masters. And we give it about 2 sentences in our history books, and it's too bad. We should give it way more coverage. But this idea of independence starts to run rampant. Well, you've got the creation of the United States based on that kind of thinking. In Europe, the European governments begin to look at this subgroup of people who have value and who have participated for centuries in the welfare of these nations, but they don't have citizenship. And so, again, it depends on where you are, but the Dutch and the French and the Scots and the English and the Germans a little bit begin to give citizenship to the Jews who had previously been on the fringe but had demonstrated loyalty, participation, served in the military. You are all familiar with the Anne Frank story, the little girl who ends up in the concentration camp. Her dad was a German officer serving the German nation in World War I, and 20 years later, he is disenfranchised and his children end up in a concentration camp. So what Hitler went back to was part of an ancient attitude in the European countries that the Jews weren't citizens. But Anne Frank's dad had been part of a process where the German Jew had been granted citizenship and participation in the nation. The French Jew had been granted citizenship and participation in the nation. And so this Enlightenment movement, yes, it gave birth to countries like the United States, but within Europe itself, it also allowed the Jew to become part of the nation they'd already been living in. And again, depending on where you were, Sometimes they had greater benefits and other times they were more restricted, but they were given citizenship. Now, a little bit later, in the 1800s, there's an addition to this idea. And it's this thing called self-determinism. And it actually defines this idea specifically that a people group should have a nation in which they can live to take care of themselves. And at that point in Europe, it births this thing called the Zionist movement. And the Zionist movement has taken hundreds of years of this attitude from the end of the Seder, next year in Jerusalem. Well, based on this political philosophy, the Jews in Europe are saying, thank you for letting us be citizens in your country, but we'd like a country of our own. So the 1800s, mid-1800s, sees the birth of this Zionist movement in which European Jews become focused on the fact that they should be allowed to return to a homeland and claim it as their homeland, a reestablishment of the state of Israel. And it's just super important to them. And again, the religious ones look back at the scholars who are saying, that's what the Bible says. That's what the law of Moses says, that we shall return to the homeland. And now politically, look at this coincidence that the European governments are teaching things like this. We should take advantage of it. And so this begins the real hardcore movement in Europe amongst the European Jews to create a homeland for themselves. So I'm out of time for tonight, or for today. I feel like I'm teaching my college class. Next week is a breakfast connection. So come ready for that next week. And then the week after that, I'll finish this thing. It's like the Roman Empire. It just goes on forever. Lord Jesus, we thank you for your kindness to us and for this opportunity to gather together to honor you. And Lord, we do pray that you would speak to our hearts. Lord, encourage us, help us to honor you, walk in your ways. And Lord, we just commit this time into your hands and pray for your blessing in Jesus' name.